Welcome back to Man vs. Meeple, the show where we talk about everything board game related. I am Jeremy Salinas. Today we are bringing you the brand new Uwe Rosenberg game. It is a worker placement game. My favorite. It is a feast for Odin, and it is a monster of a game.
It is a monster of a game. If you can't see it and appreciate it on our table right now, this is probably the biggest footprint we've had on the table so far.
I think so.
For sure.
I think
and this is
so.
set up for a 4-player game, but even as a 2-player game, most of this stuff would still be out there.
Yeah, you'd only really lose the 2-player boards at the end, right? I mean,
Right.
everything else would be played by the players. So let's get this out of the way. It is 61 worker spots that you can go to.
Yeah, the player board where you place your workers has, like Jeremy said, 61 spots. Now, don't let that intimidate you because they're all kind of grouped in areas that kind of all make sense, and they do varying degrees of the same thing to some extent.
That's right.
But there's a lot of options.
So the game revolves around players being Vikings and going out into the countryside and building their home board up with stuff they've salvaged throughout the countries. Right?
Exactly.
So let's explain all the components, David. There's a lot, and I'm going to go through them as quickly as I can.
Yeah.
There's a home board that each of the players is going to start with. The home board has places for boats, which they can acquire. Mm-hmm. There is a feast table at the upper right-hand portion, which houses their workers, but they also have to feed those empty spots on their turns. You have a place where your workers will go back to every turn. You have a place for sheep and cattle to accumulate, and then you have the actual board in which you'll be placing your tiles and all the tiles and resources in the game. This will allow you to gain bonus resources. It'll allow you to gain your income, and it'll allow you to cover up some of the negative spots in there throughout the course of the game.
And it really is the driving force of this game.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is sort of the core, not mechanic, but the core goal that you're shooting for.
That's right.
You want to cover these spaces up. Most of this is covered by -1 victory point spots.
Right.
You get all of those if you don't cover them up. So the game is, in a very general sense, about collecting various types of resources, doing things to convert those resources so that you can use them on that portion of the board.
That's right. You have resource tiles in a 4-player game. You have 3 of these. On these resource tiles, you have your 4 main resources, which are wood, stone, ore, and silver. Mm-hmm. You'll be able to use worker placement spaces to gather those. You have like a pillage tile. Basically, this is resources that you can get from 3 different ways. You can either forge them. You can pillage them by going out on long ships and raiding the countryside.
Or you can just buy them,
Or you can just buy them outright from a worker placement spot. And again, these are going to go on your board. Now, there is a main board, but there's other boards you can get too. There's islands, and then there are these areas too. You have sheds, you have stone sheds, and then you have longhouses.
Yeah, as if not covering up all these -1s was enough.
Right.
You can grab even more things. Now, the cool thing about those is even though they come with some of those spots that you have to cover up by the end of the game, or need to try to anyway, there's a lot more easier options to surround and get extra resources throughout the game.
That's right.
Even more income as well.
And they're worth victory points at the end.
Yes, of course.
So they're worth
victory
acquiring. You have 2 giant game trays full of all the tiles in the game. They're very useful because they coordinate these resources by color code and by size.
Right.
And the way the game works is you'll be upgrading these components. So when you go from a level, you just simply turn it over or you grab the next level up, which is really great.
Each of the resources kind of categorized in a way that makes sense. And they start usually down on the orange.
Right.
Orange turns to red, red turns to green, green turns to blue.
That's a good point. You have 4 islands that you can go to.
Yeah.
And these islands are also double-sided. And through the course of the games, they'll flip over. So you can kind of pick and choose which island you may want to grab.
Yeah, these islands, a lot like a lot of the things in this game, are just one more of those elements that make you think, oh, maybe I should go get that. Because as Jeremy was just starting to point out, these islands sit out there for anyone to go to using a certain space on the board to acquire and then to use. And as the game goes on, the islands, the longer they sit out there, you flip them over, you add money to them. At certain points, there's like 6 silver on some of these islands that make them really attractive to go to. But some of them are there's a risk reward there,
Right.
because some of them have a lot of great things going on, some big victory points, but a lot more negative ones that you need to cover up too.
That's right. 4 more sets of components. You have your occupation cards, very Agricola-like. You'll acquire these through the course of the game. You'll go to action spaces, which will allow you to turn them over to either take one-time immediate actions, every-time actions, or
Ongoing effects. The ongoing
right.
effects are the things that really sort of
Tailor the way that you play the game.
That and lead me off into wrong directions.
Wild directions, right. You have weapon cards. The weapon cards will be used. Now, there's no player interaction in the game, so you're not going to be fighting people. You'll just be blocking spots. But the weapon cards will be used for whaling, snaring animals,
raiding and pillaging.
And hunting, right.
Right.
And then you have the 2 main things. You have your action board, which has the 61 spaces. There are 2 expansion ones for a 4-player game, which add 2 more spaces. And then you have the turn order track, which is brilliant.
The turn order track, probably the greatest single component in this game, because you can really set this thing out, and while everyone else is about to fall over from intimidation, you can just kind of very easily go down that list and say, here's how you play. Because it really is very systematic and simple when you follow those steps every single round.
Right. So let's talk about the worker placement area. There's a ton of spaces. But let's look at the way it's organized. You have this yellow strip on the side. These categorize the rows.
Right.
So you have like crafting, you have shipyards, you have the ability to pull resources off the board, you have the ability to play cards from your hand.
Livestock.
Right.
And you'll find that these categories kind of fit into these different ways and routes to victory.
That's right.
You know, the games that we've played, there's been categories. In fact, there's still categories neither of us have used in our plays so far, which speaks to the amount of options that you really have in this game. In fact, I think it was our second game, you started using some category and really went heavy down the livestock path.
That's right.
And it's amazing to see someone score so many points in one game that no one scored in the last game, and doing it in a way that neither of us had.
You did the same thing. You went to the whaling spaces and were able to pull off a lot of whaling options.
Right. It's really it's. I'm just now thinking about it still. Amazing how many different ways you can score points
and
in this game.
And how simplistic it is, too.
Right.
I mean, it really is as intimidating as it looks. It's such a simply organized game.
Right.
It's easy to follow. So we talked about the rows. Now, the columns are the important part because this is where you'll be placing your workers. If you place in column 1, it only requires 1 worker. Column 2 is 2, 3, and then 4 for the last column. Of course, you can't go where other players have gone before, so you're blocked out of those locations. But if you go in the 3rd spot, where you're placing 3 workers on any of those column spaces, you get to draw a new occupation card.
Right.
If you play in the 4th spot, you get to play an occupation card. So it's an added bonus for using a lot of your workers that turn.
It just makes those columns a little bit more, gives a little more efficiency to it. I mean, because there are spots on the board where you can go to draw a card or to play a card or more than 1 card. But those are just kind of like a bonus action in addition to whatever you're doing.
That's right. So let's talk through a turn order. Let's just tell them how the game is played, and we'll walk through a turn. So the very first thing that happens on a turn is that each player is going to gather 1 more of their worker from their worker pool. And these are lined along across the banquet table. So you just pull a worker down, goes in your worker pool, that's 1 more worker. And this is the cool thing about the worker placement too. In most worker placement games, you're trying to acquire as many workers as you can. In this game, everybody has the same number of workers every single round.
It kind of takes that out of the equation. Some people will probably miss that a little bit.
Sure.
I personally like that because it's not something you have to think about. Everyone's getting them at the same pace. On the flip side, like Jeremy said at the beginning of the game, this same spot is where you feed your workers. So as the more empty it is, the more you have to feed, obviously.
That's right.
And that becomes like quite a bit of food towards the end of the game.
Right. The next thing is the harvest. Depending upon what round you're on, you're going to gather orange resources for all the players. The earlier rounds, you're gathering the smaller resources. The later rounds, you're gathering the larger resources.
That really helps feeding, too.
It does.
And again, another streamlined function in this game that takes a lot of that drag of collecting food and feeding out of it just a little bit. You still have to pay attention to that, but that helps a little bit.
And the harvest only happens every other round, typically,
Right.
too. So you're still having to go out there and forge resources in order to feed your people. So,
Exactly.
The third thing that happens is you're going to flip the boards in a sequential order. So only in specific rounds you'll flip the A board, the B board, the C board, and the D board.
For the islands, right.
And these are the islands. Anytime you flip an island, all the other islands get 2 silver on them. And that's kind of an incentive for players to go out to visit those
Right.
islands and acquire them into their bank. So
Yeah, at first those aren't the most attractive things, especially if you're new to the game. You're just trying to figure out your own stuff.
Right.
But as the money starts to stack up on those things, it's hard not to look because money's pretty tight.
It is. The next thing is every player in the game is going to draw 1 weapon from the weapon stack. That's just going to go into their tab below. They'll be able to use for all those things that we had mentioned earlier. And then the meat of the game. Players in turn order are going to be placing or doing actions on the action board. A player on their turn can place 1 or 4 workers or any combination of those on the board. And it's just 1 action. And you just keep going around until every player has placed all their workers or they pass.
Right, and what's cool about that, because there are spaces from 1 to 4, it's going to make whoever places last different.
Right.
So it's not just going to go around. I might finish out because I placed all my guys in 4 spots, and Jeremy's just been going 1, 1, 1.
Right.
And the cool element about that, and we'll get to that next, is when everyone's done, you determine who the first player is, or the start player is, and it's whoever went last.
Yeah.
So if you were taking sort of the less juicy spots
That's
on
right.
the board and playing a little more slowly paced, you're going to be first player next time.
The next thing that happens is the income.
Right.
And you're going to gather income according to your income boards. There's 2 ways to gather income. One is from your main board, and one is from the islands that you could possibly visit. And you're going to gather income according to where you are on this diagonal line.
Yeah, there's a diagonal line that goes from 0 all the way to 18. And we won't go into great detail about how you have to manage this thing,
Yeah.
but as you cover this up, if you cover up from the lower left-hand corner and go forward, you're going to basically get income equal to the lowest value still visible.
Right.
And again, there are some rules that you have to have a lot, you have to have a perfect square covered up, everything to the left and below that value.
Right.
But that's how tight this income is, because it's going to take a while to even get up to 5. I mean,
know.
honestly, in our games, we really haven't been getting much more than 6 or 7.
It's not only that, David, but it's like David kind of alluded to. You have to place specific tiles on these boards. Your home boards will only take blue and green tiles. Right? And your feeding can only take the red and orange tiles. And then your locations that are overseas...
The islands are pretty much similar to your home board.
Right, and then these tiles can take anything.
Right.
So you're constantly managing those things. Now, when do you place these on your board? It's an anytime action.
Yeah.
So anytime you gather any of these tiles, you're allowed to place it on your board and arrange it as you see fit. However, once it's placed... It's placed. It can't be moved.
There's no rearranging the board.
Right.
That would be a nightmare, and it would probably be an 8-hour game if people could do that.
So once the income is done, your animals will breed. If you have 2 sheep, you turn one of the sheep over to a pregnant side. If you have 2 cows, you do the same. If you had a pregnant cow or sheep, they give birth to a new tile, which is placed into your pen.
Right.
The next action is the feast.
The feast.
You go ahead and explain feeding.
It's feeding time. So in the feast, you'll see on the board here, any empty space here along the banquet table is someone that needs to be fed. So you're going to take your reds and your oranges and place them side by side. Now here are some rules as well. You can't have 2 oranges next to each other. You can't have 2 reds next to each other.
That's right.
So you have to space them out, and you have to collect the right resources so that you have what you need to space them out appropriately. Because if you have, and even when you do that, if you have 2 of the same type of food, the second one gets turned on its end, so it's going to take maybe less space.
Yeah.
Now, with that said, there are some food items that are square,
Yeah.
which are nice because you can rotate those, and there's
Doesn't
really
matter.
no downside to that. You can also put coins on there,
Yeah.
but you can't put ore.
Right.
So the coins are a nice little mechanism for spacing things out as well.
Yeah. After you feed, the next thing you're going to do is get your bonuses. Any of your areas on your board or your islands that are completely surrounded, these could be bonuses like stone or wood or extra meat or extra ore. As long as they're surrounded and not covered up, you get to collect that resource.
Right, and the nice thing is those are considered covered as it relates to your income and covering the board.
Right.
But if you have to, and that's one of the trickier things about the home board is surrounding those little things.
That's right.
But they're nice to get for sure. And on the islands, those items are even more attractive. That's one of the things that I think a lot of people will overlook is just how attractive some of those items are, because they're not the little ones like these. They're the bigger tiles.
And some of them have 2 on them.
And yeah, some of them have 2 on them. Oh, you mean 2 in one spot?
2 in one spot.
Oh, I never noticed that.
Yeah, some of them have 2 in one spot. So.
And if you hadn't gotten this already, the idea here is the bigger the tiles, the better.
Yeah.
Generally speaking. I mean, those rules for placing can be a little challenging, but if you have a big tile, you're able to, in one fell swoop, cover a lot of those negative ones.
That's right. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to refresh the resources that are available. If any spot only has 1 of the coin sections left, that is removed. However, if it has any other resources on there, they're kept. A new tile comes out, and you place resources on that. And the reason why is because there's spots on there where you can take from one of the resource strips or multiple resource strips.
And I have to say, we didn't mention this. The resource gathering in this game is really interesting to me. Unlike Caverna or Agricola, where you go to a spot for wood or you go to a spot for stone, these are basically landscapes that have a random selection of wood, stone, or money. And when you take from them, you take from the left to the right. So usually it's going to be wood first and then stone. So there's some strategy involved with how and when you're taking your resources. It's really, really cool.
It's done in a very clever way, too, is because all these resources are used for a variety of different things on the worker placement spots. They're used for hunting and whaling and pillaging and for building new structures and all kinds of things. So.
Right, the resources, and we didn't talk about the hunting and the pillaging, but Jeremy had mentioned the weapons cards.
Yeah.
In addition to the weapons cards, like he was just saying, the resources can also be used basically as a mitigation device for the dice rolling. Because when you're hunting and when you're raiding and pillaging, you do roll these dice.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of you might go, ugh, dice. But really, the amount of mitigation that you have in this game is fantastic.
Immense,
because you can get to a point where you have a little engine built up, so you're rolling your dice and not even worrying about what you're going to roll because you've built up a sort of an environment that allows you to pillage at will.
Consistently, that's right. The next thing that happens is all players are going to get their workers back, they put them back in the pool, and you start a new round.
Right.
And that's basically it. Guys, I got to say, this is easily a top contender for my top 10 games of the year, and probably one of my favorite games, period. His games have gotten progressively... I don't want to say they're more complicated because this isn't a complicated game at all, but it acts like it is because there's so many options to it, but it's such a simple design.
I think his trick is that it's more complicated on one hand, but so streamlined on the other hand.
Yes.
So those things sort of like counter each other and ends up being, especially if you've played some of his games, you can easily get into this game really well.
Yeah, and I love options. I love options in games, and I don't think I've ever played a game that has 61 worker placement spots. I mean, it's immense, all the different things you can try.
And with that said, until we've played many, many, many games of this and know all the different routes that you can take to victory, even when Jeremy and I have played 2-player game versions of this, we've gotten in each other's way.
Yeah.
You know, because now as we explore, like I said, those different routes, we might be able to avoid each other a little bit better in a 2-player game. But when it comes to gathering resources, there are some really nice resource gathering spots.
Yeah.
At least in the few games we've played, those have been some pretty key spots. Although when you played the livestock, you didn't really gather much in the way of resources that game.
I didn't, which is phenomenal because I was still able to win going down one very specific route.
You won decisively, and you didn't collect much, if any, resources throughout the whole game.
And that's just the variety in the board. Now, there's occupation cards. There's 3 decks of occupation cards. There's 190 unique cards that can lead you down different paths and give you special bonuses and abilities throughout the course of the game. It's phenomenal.
Right.
I mean, absolutely phenomenal game. I have zero bad to say about this game. Nothing.
I think it could have used a 64th spot on the board.
That's funny. So, guys, go check it out. That is A Feast for Odin. Easily a contender for one of my top 10 games of the year. Make sure you guys make comments below. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, please. Follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. And check us out on the next Man vs. Meeple.
Bye-bye.
Season 1 of Man vs. Meeple is sponsored by TMG Games, publisher of great games like Yokohama, Guilds of London, and the soon-to-be-released Colosseum.